We might also point towards principles of proportionality. Military actions have to be proportional to the threat they seek to defeat. There is no excuse in war for wanton violence. Right? Now, this has straightforward implications. One does not respond, for example, to a border skirmish through the use of nuclear weapons. That is a disproportionate reaction. However, there are some complications with the proportionality principle as well. You'll be shocked to hear philosophers like to disagree with each other. What if certain weapons are always immoral? For example, nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon can be viewed as intrinsically immoral because it is never a proportional reaction. They are too dangerous. Now, this is a debatable claim, but let's run with it. Now, defenders of nuclear weapons might say, okay, look, using a nuclear weapon is fundamentally immoral. Why? They disproportionately affect innocent civilians. They kill way more people than necessary. They poison the earth. They might create a cascade that destroys the earth if we get into atomic firing. They will look at, the deaths that happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they will say, okay, look, this is bad. What happened to the civilian population of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is deeply lamentable. But think about what Paul Fussell wrote in Thank God for the Atomic Bomb. He said, the virtue is that it ended the war quickly. And we might take a step back and say, the real importance of nuclear weapons is not in their use. It is in their deterrent value. The response we might have to this, or the question we might have, is the threat of an immoral act in itself? It might be. If I threaten to shoot an innocent person, that seems to be a pretty bad thing to do, even if it deters, a bad guy from doing something bad. We might say that this is just all we can do in a bad situation. It's excusable because of the threat of nuclear war. Because enemy states have nuclear weapons, we need to have them simply to deter them. In a world where everyone's pointing guns at each other, you don't put your gun down. But the threat of nuclear war leads us to an interesting element of just war theory, and that is the supreme emergency exemption. Now, this comes up as a statement that sometimes the rules get suspended. Sometimes the threat you're faced with is so great that the ordinary restrictions on the conventions of war have to be ignored. Now, there are two conditions for the supreme emergency exemption to come into play. The first is an imminent threat. The supreme emergency requires the threat being faced is not abstract. It's not in some undefined future 10 years from now. Think about back in 2003 when they were justifying the war in Iraq. They said, Saddam Hussein might develop a nuclear weapon in 20 years' time, which he could then use to blow up Washington. Well, no, you can't. That doesn't mean you get out of the laws of war. It has to be imminent, not eminent. That's a philosopher's distinction. The other thing is the scale of threat. The threat has to be extremely serious. Usually, this is articulated in terms of an existential threat to the state. So what's a real-world example of this? Let's talk about terror bombing in the Second World War, but not by the Nazis, by the RAF, by the British. Between 1940 and 1943, the RAF bombed German cities, killing some 300,000 civilians. It's why Bomber Harris, the guy who was in charge of the British Air Force, wasn't given a public statue for quite some time. This was a very controversial decision within the British government to start fighting this way. So why did they decide it was okay? Well, at that time, Britain will say it was standing alone against the threat of Nazi Germany. Now, of course, Britain wasn't standing alone. It had Canada, it had Australia, it had New Zealand, it had India, it had all of its African colonies, but it was thinking really in terms of the British Empire. So let's say Britain was standing without allies against Nazi Germany, victorious in France, seeming to dominate Europe. The threat was imminent, and the threat was existential, right? Hitler was planning to invade the United Kingdom. If Germany occupied the UK, the same thing that happened across Europe would have happened in Britain. The idea was that by bombing German cities indiscriminately, it would sufficiently hamper the war effort by destroying Germany's industrial capacity to fight, but it would also destroy the morale of German citizens. They would become unwilling to fight. They would be unwilling to take those deaths. Now, there are many bad excuses. Sometimes it's revenge. Sometimes it's punishment. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that it was the only means available, right? Britain will say there were no other way to fight this war. Now, oftentimes states use the idea of an existential threat somewhat disingenuously. During the War on Terror, for example, President Bush and other politicians like Tony Blair put this sort of war against al-Qaeda as a threat to the American way of life. They hate our liberty. They want to destroy us. Now, even if that were true, the threat posed by a terrorist network is fundamentally different from the threat posed by Nazi Germany to the UK in 1940. I'll give you another example, right? So let's think about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those atomic attacks. Was the United States fighting an imminent and existential threat? The answer looks like no. By 1945, Japan could no longer strike at the continental United States, or any American territory for that matter, maybe some of the islands, but certainly not in a way that would destroy America. Walzer says it wasn't an imminent threat, it wasn't an existential threat. Japan did not have a path to victory in 1945. The threat posed by Imperial Japan to America in 1945 was not the threat posed by Nazi Germany to the UK in 1940. Japan may have been an aggressive state. It may have been guilty of war crimes. It may have done terrible things, but it did not threaten the very structure of the international order or the survival of the American Republic. It does not constitute a supreme emergency that justifies the use of atomic weapons. So how should someone like Walzer respond to people who say, the atomic bombs may have killed a lot of civilians, but the consequences were good, right? It ended the war. It saved lives. You know, the number of lives lost, both Japanese and American, in an invasion of the Japanese homeland is indescribable. You know, American military planners estimated 1 million American service casualties, say nothing of the Japanese military or Japanese civilians. It saved lives. The atomic bombs saved lives. Now, the response I think Walzer has to this is that the rights of Japanese non-combatants are not negotiable, right? There needs to be an obligation to find ways to prevent attacks against non-combatants except under the supreme emergency. This hinges on those means being available, right? There has to be a way to get to victory without the use of atomic weapons. But presumably there would have been other means that were less harmful. We might think about a negotiated peace. We might think about the use of naval blockade, although those disproportionately affect civilians as well. We might look at what the Allied war aims were in 1945. Now, the Allies agreed that they wanted the unconditional surrender of Japan. That might have been unreasonable. There might have been a pathway to peace that saved lives that required some concessions from the Allies, but they wanted total victory in response to a total war. So let's summarize what we've said about jus and bello. Jus and bello is focused on the ethics of warfare. It's conceptually independent from jus ad bellum. It is characterized by two basic principles, non-combatant immunity and proportionality. However, it recognizes exceptions. One is the doctrine of double effect and intention, which says under certain stringent circumstances, it is excusable to harm or kill civilians. And the supreme emergency exemption, which says sometimes the rules get suspended. But what happens when war is done? That's what we're going to talk about next. Jus post bellum.